The shocking truth about the carnivore diet that you need to know.
What is the shocking truth about the carnivore diet? This is Dr. Gundry, a medical doctor, board-certified heart surgeon, and online health creator with millions of followers. In recent times, Dr. Gundry has spoken out and made it clear that he sees the carnivore diet not just as a bad diet, but also potentially dangerous. So in this video, we're going to look at exactly what Dr. Gundry said about the carnivore diet and break down why his claims are wrong. Let's get into it.
There's absolutely zero evidence of long-living people eating a carnivore diet. If a carnivore diet was as good as its proponents say it is for long-term health, surely we should have been able to find a society that has long-term great health on a carnivore diet. And that simply does not exist.
That is simply not true. For an entire year between 1915 and 1916, a man named Vilmer Stephenson, who was an Arctic explorer and anthropologist, lived with the Inuit population. Here's what he reported. In the Arctic, I learned that the Eskimos who had lived exclusively on meat and fish were healthier than any other people I had ever known. We had no fruit, no vegetables, no milk, no eggs, nothing but meat. Yet the Eskimos were strong, hearty, and free from disease. To further support what Mr. Stephenson reported, we can actually look at the fossilized remains from the Inuit people who lived around this time. In these fossils, what we see is no signs of vitamin deficiencies, no signs of obesity, diabetes, or heart disease, minimal evidence of tooth decay or cavities, and high bone density, meaning they had strong bones. So it's very clear that this long-term society from only 110 years ago, with an estimated 40,000 people on a carnivore diet, was in fact very healthy. Now, how long did these people live for? Well, it's hard to know exactly. They didn't have birth certificates or calendars, so nobody knows for sure. But what we do know is that they didn't get chronic disease like we do now, so likely they lived a very long time. You might be wondering why I'm referring to the carnivorous Inuit population in past tense when the Inuit population still exists nowadays. Well, unfortunately, by the 1950s, the Inuit began regular contact with Western traders. As you can imagine, life wasn't the easiest for these people living in the freezing cold, having to fish and hunt every day. So when these Westerners offered them Western food in the form of white flour, sugar, candy, canned meats, and whatever other Western food you can think of, they were more than happy to accept. So they started eating these foods, and nowadays, as a result of this, the Inuit population on these Western foods are like any other Western nation. Today, some Inuit populations have diabetes rates over 25%. Their teeth have cavities, obesity is widespread, and there is a large prevalence of heart disease. Dr. Otto Schoeffer, who worked in the Canadian Arctic from the 1950s, wrote, "In the early years, diabetes and heart disease were virtually non-existent. But within one generation of adopting the white man's diet, we saw a disaster unfold." Interestingly, the entire world saw a very similar pattern occur. Dr. Gundry may not know this, but his very own ancestors were carnivores. For millions of years, up until about 12,000 years ago, humans ate very close to exclusively meat, which is clearly shown in our fossil records. When we look at these fossils from carnivorous humans prior to 12,000 years ago, again, they are in great health. They have large jaws with perfect teeth free from cavities, large brains demonstrating an abundance of nutrients, and the fossils had very few lesions and markings on them. This is particularly important as lesions and markings on a fossil are what indicate disease. So as a whole, these carnivorous fossils were very healthy. But 12,000 years ago, we started agriculture, which is when we started domesticating and eating plants. And these more recent fossils were found from humans that ate a combination of meat and plants. A completely different story unfolds. These fossils have smaller jaws with crooked teeth and lots of cavities. The brains on average are a whopping 11% smaller, and there is a much greater prevalence of lesions and markings on them. So we clearly got much sicker when we started incorporating plants into our diet. Stanley J. Ulasek, an anthropologist who researches health patterns around the world, has stated, when populations around the globe started turning to agriculture, regardless of their locations and type of crops, a similar trend occurred. The height and the health of the people declined. Skeletal analysis suggests these Neolithic peoples experienced greater physiological stress due to undernutrition and infectious disease. With humans, like any other animal, the same pattern always appears. When a species eats what it's always eaten and is therefore biologically adapted to eat, they are very healthy. But when they eat a diet consisting of foods they have not historically eaten, they get very sick. Dr. Gundry says there are no long-living carnivorous groups of people. Historically, however, that is simply not true. He nor you or I would be here if that was the case.
Looking at areas of the world that have extreme longevity, the blue zones and other zones, all of these areas have one thing in common. All of these areas in general, eat a very low animal protein diet. That's what appears to be the major driver of this longevity.
For those who are unaware, the blue zones are 5 regions in the world that have a much higher life expectancy than the global average. The claim is that in all of these blue zones, they eat mostly plant foods with very little meat. But this is simply not true. When you travel to the blue zones, the people in these regions actually do eat a lot of meat. In Sardinia, for example, meat, particularly pork, goat, and lamb, is a staple in the diet. In Nicoya, Costa Rica, their traditional diet includes plenty of animal products like eggs, lard, as well as beef or chicken. In Ikaria, Greece, goat, meat, pork, and fish are all part of the local cuisine. In Okinawa, Japan, meat consumption historically was low due to poverty, but nowadays pork is a staple in the diet. In fact, word on the street is that the Okinawans have their own saying, which is, Okinawans eat every part of the pig except the squeal. And in Loma Linda, California, the data is skewed by the Seventh-day Adventist community, which promotes veganism. So while the narrative claims that blue zones are long-lived because they avoid meat, the reality is most of these regions include meat regularly in their diets. The founder of the Blue Zones documentary, who served as the executive producer, is a man named Dan Buettner. This is a man who promotes a plant-based diet and has written books focused on plant-based eating. Which, I mean, you can call me a conspiracy theorist, but I suspect this may have something to do with the reporting of the blue zones. What's also interesting is the age claims of the people living inside these blue zones. The claim is that the people in these regions live on average 85 to 90 years, but there is essentially zero proof of this. For example, in Okinawa, Japan, government investigations have revealed hundreds of fraudulent age claims. After a 2010 audit, Japanese officials found that there were over 230,000 people claiming to be over the age of 100 who were either completely missing or long deceased, despite being listed as alive in the records. In Ikaria and Sardinia, birth registration wasn't standardized until the 20th century, meaning many individuals claiming to be over 100 have had uncertain or unverifiable birth dates. Even in Nicoya, some age claims are based on local church records, or they're just recorded orally. So all these people that are claiming to be really old don't have government-issued documents. So in reality, the blue zones aren't areas where people eat plant-based diets and live a long time. They are actually areas where people eat a lot of meat and we don't actually know how long they do live for. What's interesting is that the nation with the highest average life expectancy in the world is Hong Kong, which is also the country that eats the most meat.
There is a sugar molecule in beef, lamb, and pork called Nu5GC. We have an antibody that can be developed when we're exposed to Nu5GC containing foods, that we will attack our own blood vessels with that antibody. So we don't want an autoimmune attack on our blood vessels, and there is considerable experimental evidence that one of the reasons that red meat promotes heart disease is actually from this molecule Nu5GC prompting an autoimmune attack on our blood vessels.
At this point, he's just making stuff up. As Dr. Gundry stated, Nu5GC is a sugar molecule found on the surface of some animal cells, such as in beef, pork, and lamb. The claim that some plant-based advocates like to make is that because humans don't produce Nu5GC, the human immune system may recognize it as a foreign molecule, which could then lead to an autoimmune attack, which is where the body mistakenly attacks itself. But there is zero evidence anywhere showing Nu5GC actually causes this to happen in humans. Never has it been demonstrated that eating a steak will cause your own body to attack its own blood vessels, or any part of the body for that matter. There is, however, plenty of evidence against this idea. In large-scale cohort studies, people who eat lots of red meat do not have higher rates of autoimmune diseases than people who eat low amounts of red meat. In nations that eat the most red meat, for example, Argentina, USA, Australia, they do not have higher rates of autoimmune diseases than populations that eat less. Also, if this was true, we should see it clearly demonstrated that people who eat lots of red meat have higher rates of autoimmune diseases than people who eat lots of chicken and fish. This is because chicken and fish do not contain Nu5GC, but there is zero difference in rates of autoimmune diseases between these groups. What Dr. Gundry has done is called mechanistic speculation, which is where you come to conclusions based on biological mechanisms or theories without any clinical or real-world evidence that supports them. When someone makes a claim saying there is considerable experimental evidence and doesn't cite even a single study, it's pretty clear that there isn't in fact considerable experimental evidence.
The other thing that's concerning is that tumor cells can use Nu5GC to hide from our immune system, to cloak themselves. Now here's the deal. You and I do not produce new 5GC. So the only place a tumor cell could get new 5GC is for you to eat it in beef, lamb, or pork. And that's why there is an association. Now just remember, association does not mean causation, but there is an association between red meat eating and cancer, particularly colon cancer and even breast cancer.
Again, this right here is simply not true. The idea that tumors can hide from your immune system simply because of this one type of sugar found in meat is just completely ridiculous speculation based on absolutely no evidence. Then he goes on to say this is why there is an association between eating meat and some cancers, which he debunked himself by saying correlation does not equal causation. The only reason there is a slight association between meat consumption and some cancers in some studies is due to something called healthy user bias. Ever since the 1960s, meat has been villainized. So people from the general population who eat a lot of meat are much less likely to care about their health. So they smoke more, drink more, eat more processed foods, exercise less, so forth. Whereas people from the general population who have listened to the mainstream health advice and decide to eat less meat are much more likely to care about their health. So they smoke less, drink less, eat less processed foods, exercise more, so forth. Not to mention, in all the studies that link meat intake to cancer risk, they also include meat as anything that contains meat. So pizzas, burgers, hot dogs, anything with meat in it is included as meat. The reason meat is linked to some cancers isn't because meat causes cancer, it's because the people eating meat in these studies are people eating lots of processed foods that live unhealthy lifestyles. And the thing is, Gundry himself knows this. Don't you, Dr. Gundry? That's why he said correlation does not equal causation. Yet for some reason he still tried to make his point using this poor data.
In general, the less animal protein that you can get, the better. And when I ask my patients to reduce animal protein, I see dramatic reductions in a blood marker called insulin-like growth factor. And as a general rule, the lower your insulin-like growth factor, the longer you live well, and quite frankly, the less chance of cancer developing. So why not go after that?
Gundry, mate, come on. At this point, it is getting ridiculous. He has also made this up entirely. IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor 1, is a hormone similar in structure to insulin, hence the name, which plays a key role in growth, cell repair, and just overall development. It is thought that high meat consumption increases IGF-1 due to its high protein intake, which stimulates the production of growth hormone and then in turn IGF-1. But even if meat does increase IGF-1, there is zero evidence anywhere suggesting that having lower levels of IGF-1 will make you live longer or have less chance of developing cancer, or any disease for that matter. Again, he hasn't sourced a single study, which goes to show he has absolutely no proof to support this made-up claim. When people have low levels of IGF-1, they usually run into a number of issues regarding muscle loss, fatigue, as well as overall poor recovery. But for some reason, Dr. Gundry is trying to say that very low IGF levels are what you should be aiming for. I'm not exactly sure how that makes sense, to be honest.
So why do people get good results with the carnivore diet? Well, it's because you're eliminating lectins. But all of my carnivore diet patients, when we look at their inflammatory markers, over time, their inflammatory markers of vessel flexibility, begin to get worse and worse. So short term, to fix a problem with an affront of plant compounds against your gut, I've got nothing wrong with that. But long term, I can tell you in my patient population, it looks like a recipe for disaster. Once you fix the underlying problem, it's time to wean yourself from the carnivore diet.
To me, this right here is the most confusing part about Dr. Gundry. He is essentially known as the doctor who was against lectins, which are a defense compound found in plants such as beans, tomatoes, and many grains that can bind to the gut lining or to other cells and trigger an inflammatory response. But Dr. Gundry is so strongly against lectins, he tells everyone to avoid them, even wrote an entire book on the topic. Yet for some reason he has no problem with all the other plant defense compounds. In every single plant there are hundreds of potentially problematic compounds that the plant uses to defend itself from attackers. But Dr. Gundry ignores all of these other compounds and says that lectins are the only problematic one. To me, it just makes absolutely zero sense. He says the reason some people see improvements on a carnivore diet is because they're removing lectins. No, Dr. Gundry, it's because people are removing hundreds, if not thousands of different toxic plant compounds, as well as for many other reasons. And supposedly in his patient population of people on carnivore, their health seems to deteriorate over time. Firstly, I'd like to know how many people in his patient population are actually on a carnivore diet. Considering he's a doctor who advocates for a plant-based diet, I wouldn't imagine there are more than like 5. Secondly, the longer people are on a carnivore diet, typically what happens is that their inflammatory markers get better and better. Now, if this is true, and this has happened to Dr. Gundry's patients on carnivore, what I suspect it could be is that Dr. Gundry tells people if they're going to eat meat, they should only eat fish and chicken.
These carnivore diets are based on animals with new 5-GC. So what I did with these people is I said, hey, okay, it's working great. Okay, well, let's not try to get plants into you right now, but do me a favor. Let's start eating pastured chicken. Let's get wild seafood. Let's get wild shellfish. And let's do fermented meats like sausages, which get rid of new 5-GC. They were still carnivores, but as I talk about in the last chapter, they're now chicken in the sea carnivores.
If his carnivore patients took this advice and only ate fish and chicken, chances are they wouldn't be eating enough fat, as they are often very lean animals. Without enough fat on a carnivore diet, your hormone production is going to be inadequate. Your energy will tank and your stress hormones, they will elevate, which may show up in your lab work as your inflammatory markers being elevated. So he is either completely making it up that his patients see their inflammatory markers rise, or it's from his poor advice telling these people to eat the leaner cuts of meat. Because when people eat enough fatty meat on a carnivore diet, that doesn't typically happen. As a whole, I gotta say it's pretty disappointing that one of the most famous doctors in the world makes an entire video bashing the carnivore diet where he just completely makes up everything he's saying. Anyway, as always, great speaking with you. See you next time.